Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. If you have watched one of our Booklarder Zooms, you will know what I'm going to say, which is please, if you feel like it, at least, use the chat to tell us where you're tuning in from. One of the best parts of this has been getting to welcome people from really all over the world to these talks. So, so we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. All right, Eastern Washington, New Jersey, Port Angeles, New York, Seattle, Silver Springs, Maryland. Thank you. Toronto, I love it. Welcome, everyone. We'll give this just few more seconds, excuse me, and we'll get started. Portland, U District, all the way from Magnolia. All right. Thank you for joining us, everyone. All right, it looks like that number is stabilizing a little, so I am going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle, Washington called Booklarder. And during more normal times, we have a kitchen in the shop and we host a lot of author talks and cooking classes in person. And we have recently taken these talks to Zoom, which has been great in ways that we didn't quite expect, because we can do conversations like the one tonight where we have authors and panelists from all over the country sort of tuning in to talk about their book. And we can welcome people from all over the world to the conversation. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. We are, of course, talking about the Best American Food Writing 2020. And this edition is edited by J. Kenji Lopez-Alt, new Seattle resident, in fact. And he will be in conversation with several folks who I'm going to let introduce themselves tonight. We will also be joined by Silvia Killingsworth, who edits the series overall. We will leave time for questions, and you can just use the Q&A button in Zoom. If you're on a PC, it's at the bottom of your screen. If you could use that button for questions, it helps us keep track of those. It's just a little bit easier that way, and you can use the chat to talk to each other. And of course, the book is available on our website, booklarder.com. You can support the talk by purchasing the book from us if you are so inclined. Thank you to everyone who's done that already. And if you can wait until maybe early next week for us to ship your book, Kenji has agreed to swing by the shop and sign them. And if you can't wait, that's okay too. You can just let us know in the order notes and we'll send it out right away. All right, so I'm going to turn things over to our panel, if they would like to join in.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey, everyone. What's up?
All right, so let's go around and introduce ourselves. I'm going to start. My name is Silvia Killingsworth. I'm the series editor for Best American Food Writing. This is my third year working on this book. I'm so excited for this year's edition. And our wonderful guest editor was Kenji Lopez-Alt, who I'll hand it over to next.
Hey, I'm Kenji Lopez-Alt. I am a recent Seattle, I moved here a week ago, so we're still kind of settling in, hence all the boxes behind me. But I am the author of The Food Lab and Every Night is Pizza Night, my first children's book. And I was the guest editor of this year's, the 2020 Best American Food Writing. I also have a restaurant in San Mateo, which is not where I live anymore.
Oh, I'm
sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Should we go back to you, Sylvia?
My name.
Kwame.
Kwame.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to jump rope in.
Zoom.
My name is Kwame Onwuachi. I am a chef, author, and I wrote a book with Joshua David Stein called Notes from a Young Black Chef. And I was also featured in the book by Kenji. So I'm really excited to be here, and can't wait to interact with you all. I'll pass it over to Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Goldfield. I am the food critic for the New Yorker magazine. I write the weekly Tables for Two column, and then also various essays and reported pieces for the website and sometimes for the magazine, as in the case of the piece that was selected for this book.
And my name is Joshua David Stein. I'm an author. I co-wrote with Kwame Notes from a Young Black Chef, the excerpt of which is featured in this collection. And also wrote another piece in the collection about Jacques Pepin's omelet. I co-write cookbooks, including this year No Moi Tea Parlor Cookbook, the Il Buco Essentials Cookbook, and I also write children's books like Kenji, including Can I Eat That? What's Cooking? Can You Eat? The Ball book, which is about balls, and most recently, The Invisible Alphabet.
Amazing. I didn't say what I do, but no one really cares.
I care.
We care.
Yeah.
We care what you do. We're going to pass it over to Silvia.
I work at Bloomberg News, where I've been for 2 years. I started out there at Bloomberg Business Week, the weekly magazine, but I started my career in my early days. I used to work with Hannah. We were both at the New Yorker. She was a fact checker, and I was the assistant managing editor. And I worked there for 7 years, and then I went over to the wonderful world of the internet, and I ran a couple of small independent websites. I freelanced for The Cut and Bon Appetit, and then I landed at Bloomberg, where I am now. And I've sort of always maintained a connection to like the sort of food world. I started writing about food when I was at the New Yorker. I actually did tables for two restaurant reviews, which I loved so much. And I've kept this up as a sort of my side interest, and I'm very happy about that. So thank you guys all for coming and for joining us. So let's start. I want to kind of start with, like, for the people who haven't gotten a chance to dive into the book yet, just to talk a little bit about the pieces that you have featured in the book. And let's start with Hannah, since your piece sort of addresses some of the, the topics here, because of the panelists here. A little bit of the theme is this idea of like the celebrity chefs, or like the chef culture in general. So I know that your piece directly addresses that. So if you want to tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Maybe I'll tell the backstory of the piece, which I think is kind of interesting. I initially pitched it as just a straight profile. It ended up being a magazine print feature, and it was just supposed to be a profile of these two chefs whose restaurants I really admired. They have a number of restaurants in Montreal. Their names are David Mcmillan and Frederic Morin. I'm probably butchering that Quebecois pronunciation, but they're best known for a restaurant called Joe Beef, and then they own several other restaurants, and they're kind of like the only game in town. I mean, actually, that's not true. They're not the only game in town in Montreal, but Montreal's an amazing restaurant city, but they are, sort of the biggest names, I think a lot of people would say. And I had spent a lot of time in Montreal, and I'd eaten at all of their restaurants and just found them to be amazing. And so I pitched this profile of them because I thought they were not as well known in the US as they might be, and they just seemed deserving of the New Yorker treatment. But I had a really hard time writing it, not because I didn't find them interesting, but because I couldn't find an angle that felt different from just the kind of culture of profiling celebrity chefs. It just felt like I was like, these are just two chefs. They're both men. They're both white. Like, what else is there to say about chefs who are cooking, Eurocentric food that hasn't been said before? And then, so months went by where I was supposed to be writing this piece and just wasn't coming together. And then one of them, David Mcmillan, wrote I guess it was an essay. It was an as told to for Bon Appetit's website about his experience getting sober. And it felt like he wasn't the first chef to have done that, but I think he was one of the highest profile chefs to have done that, and it got a lot of attention. And suddenly my editor and I were kind of like, well, this is the story. What does it mean when a chef who's sort of built their whole career on this life of excess, drinking, and also eating, overeating, just kind of like more and more and more, what does it mean when he decides to really rein that in? And so, and then his partner and kind of co-chef also got sober. And so I ended up kind of reshifting the whole story and looking at what this period had been like for them and for their company, and talked to a lot of current and former employees, and just kind of examined the culture of kitchens, you know, as it kind of relied on this sort of culture of excess, and just kind of questioned all of that. So that's kind of the breakdown.
Yeah, that's a good overview. I want to go to Kwame next, and sort of like, I want to each of you sort of like daisy chain onto the next one to talk about your piece, but I also would love to hear like a little bit of Kwame's reactions to, you know, as a chef and as someone who's been in kitchens, you know, your whole life, like how have you experienced that? You know, like my personal experience, or not my experience, my understanding, you know, a lot of it is colored by like the chef memoirs that we read and all the stories that you hear about, like, you know, the Anthony Bourdain book, and who is the guy whose name I won't remember, but who's like, you know, they're all this sort of like, oh, everything to excess, and the drugs and the drinking, and the Marco Pierre White.
maybe?
Yes, correct. Yeah, exactly. And that sort of vein of, you know, is this a cultural shift? Is this a time shift? Like, did you experience any of that? Like, you know, as a younger generation of chef, like, is that something that's like definitely shifting, or what do you think about that?
I don't think it's shifting. You know, I think people are people, and you know, an industry doesn't really change who people are. You know, there are addicts in every single industry. You know, I think inherently people are addicted to something, one or the other, and they have a vice. So I don't think things have shifted that much. I think people don't talk about it as much. It's more taboo to be a little bit more upfront, especially with harder drugs. But because of the demand that you need on your body to operate in these industries, there's an abuse of something that normally happens. And that could be an abuse to yourself. You know, that can be a drug addiction, that can be an alcohol addiction, that could be abuse to your staff because you're so tired and you're acting out on them. So I don't really see a shift in how things have changed. I think, you know, it's a little bit more taboo. I think also with the, you know, very, very transparency of like social media, people are a lot more afraid because they can be held accountable if they do make mistakes. They can become very public very quickly. So there is a small shift in the way that people are doing things, but they're just hiding them a little bit better, what I think. So
right, it's still happening.
So it's still happening. So to answer your question, I don't think things are changing. You know, I think human nature, you know, I think if you go to any industry, people are doing things that are unethical, and people are doing things that are amazing. And that's just humans in totality.
Right. It strikes me as more of a thing of like the individuals growing up and deciding I can no longer put my body through this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Kenji, do you have experience with this kind of kitchen culture?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. You know, I have a slightly different take on it. I do think things are changing, particularly in the last like 5 years or so. And I think a lot of it is because of social media. You know, I started cooking in restaurants like 20 years ago, and you know, I worked for a lot of screamers, you know, people who screamed and yelled, and you know, I never worked for anyone who was physically abusive, but certainly like the sort of, you know, Anthony Bourdain, you know, macho, macho, misogynist, racist, all every kind of comment you hear in the kitchens that I worked in, and you know, so personally, like I know there are some chefs out there who have changed, who have very publicly changed. Well, you know, Mcmillan being one of them, but you know, someone like Eric Ripert, he's completely gone back on and said that he regrets, you know, when he used to yell at people. I know some of my older chefs now don't have completely changed. Some of them, after having families, they change. And personally, you know, it's like having grown up in those types of kitchens, I try and run personally try and run mine differently from that. So, you know, I do think there is a change going on, and I think the fact that there is, there is this public scrutiny, particularly, especially, after the Me Too movement and the fact that there is all this public scrutiny. Like, we just read Chris Crowley's story about what was going on at Mission Chinese, and and that was a company where it's like, it was shocking to me because having known like Danny and some of the people there, you don't, until you actually work for someone, it's hard to get a sense of what they're like as a chef in the kitchen, because some people have a very, very different sort of public personality versus their how they comport themselves professionally, and definitely not even like, with Danny's case, it wasn't necessarily how he comported himself, it was the type of behavior he was willing to overlook, which I think is what also happens a lot, is that chefs, you sort of get this attitude where it's like, well, it's a lot like being in a fraternity where it's like you undergo this hazing process, and the hazing is not necessarily done by the leader, it's just done by everyone else because they had to go through it. And as a chef, sometimes your thoughts are, well, it doesn't matter, like if they want to abuse each other, that's their business, like as long as the food comes out perfectly, that's what matters, and I do like to think that that's changing a lot. Maybe it's not. And certainly, Kwame has been in worked for more chefs and more kitchens more recently than I have. So he probably has a better finger on the pulse of what's actually going on there. Yeah, if it's not changing, then
right.
It's a shame,
it seems,
because
it seems like a lot of it is like, we're talking about these issues of like transparency or openness or visibility, right? Like,
right.
What is known about what goes on? And I think that especially with like the early days chef memoirs of the 90s or whatever, is very much like about, I think literally the jacket copy of the Bourdain book is like, something about the seamy underbelly of the kitchen world, underground world of kitchens, which is sort of like, it had this sort of frisson of like, oh, this is like this underworld that no one knew about. And now it's like, it's out in the open, people talk about it, people, post on social media or say things or talk to reporters. There's a lot more like visibility and transparency, I think.
And, I kind of focused on the sort of abuse angle of it, but, I think the excess and the abuse are sort of two sides of the same coin there, and they do tend, they often go hand in hand. Especially there's some chefs you see that are fine sober and not drunk,
right? It's not
or whatever their drug of choice is.
I would
Hannah, what were you going to add? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that what has changed is what is that kind of behavior being rewarded. I think it's exactly what Kwame says. I think the human nature is still there, the impulse is still there, people are people, but I do think that there's been a shift in how the public perceives that, how it's perceived on social media. I know that the way that I, as a writer who covers restaurants, has totally changed. I no longer I don't know that I ever thought that was like so cool. I was always kind of skeptical of it, but I do think that I'm asking myself way more now than ever, are these people behaving in ethical ways? And it actually, this sort of ties in exactly to, I think it's the chapter that was excerpted in the book from Kwame's memoir, about his various mentors and bosses at Per Se. And I was so struck in reading that back when I read the memoir, and now, of course, just out of nerves, I'm going to forget the good boss's name, who's a chef whose restaurant I wrote about. Your positive mentor, who is James. What's his last name?
James Kent. Yeah.
Kent, yeah. And I was really struck by that, and it changed the way I thought. It changed what I looked for when I went and ate at his restaurant. He opened a restaurant about a year ago now, I guess. And the food was amazing, but I was also really tuned into what I could see of how he was treating his staff and whether or not the people seemed happy and what the kitchen seemed like. And it just, that was just like a really obvious, sort of acute change in my own perception of these things.
I'm curious to know from Kwame, I'm curious to know from you, what sort of, what sort of transformation you went through going from being a cook to a chef, personally, I know that I had to do a ton of self-reflection and think about what things I experienced and how they made me feel, and how ways I've behaved in the past have made other people I work with feel. And you know, that was sort of like the most important process for me in becoming a chef and sort of becoming a, you know, leader in my own kitchen. I'm curious to hear from you what sort of process you went through and how you found the experience so far.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's all through experiences is how, you know, traits are learned, essentially, or unlearned. And I was learning within those kitchens how to be a terrible leader, essentially. You know, that's what I was learning, and I had to unlearn that. And the biggest thing, I mean, the cooking part was so easy. You know, setting up the kitchen was so easy. Setting up schedules were so easy. Learning empathy was the hardest thing, because we go through that hazing process, you know, when we're in these fine dining restaurants. So then we're like, oh, we should be doing that to our cook. You know, that's how you make them better. And it wasn't until, I don't know. I mean, I just realized it wasn't the right thing to do. But it wasn't an overnight process. It was a huge self-reflection of looking in the mirror and being like, who are you? What are you doing? You didn't like being treated like this, so why are you doing the same thing? And that's when my team started to really come together. That's when I started to thrive in the industry, when I started to treat people just exactly how I wanted to be treated, and remember the feelings that I felt when I was being hazed. You know, I obviously didn't add the layer of racism on that, you know, I went through, but it was still the, like, you know, what I say goes, my way or the highway, you know, unequivocal, this is exactly what I want. And if you don't want to do that, get out of here. And that's not how teams thrive. That's not how, you know, restaurants are successful. They can be, but I think the mark of a really great restaurant is having staff that's happy, you know, that they can go on to continue in this industry. And it was a learning process for me, because I was extremely young when I got my first restaurant, and I came straight out of these kitchens. And there was one incident that really changed my life. Was one of my cooks committed suicide, and he wasn't working for me at the time. He left and went to work at another restaurant, but he was only one restaurant removed. And it was like, I don't know, maybe I could have talked to this person nicer, you know, maybe I could have like checked in on them, and that really changed the way that I viewed my leadership skills and what I needed to do to be a better leader.
I wanted to hear from Josh a little bit. I know you've worked with a lot of chefs, and also written about a lot of chefs, and I just sort of wanted to hear what you wanted to add here.
I mean, I think one of the biggest issues that I've seen is a lot of chefs in relation to society see themselves as the underdog and the outsider, similar to a lot of journalists, as a matter of fact. And the kitchen is a hierarchical system, so they have absolute power within that system. So they go into a system where they have enormous power, but they feel disenfranchised, and they don't see, either through willful ignorance or just a lack of mindfulness, that they can't behave like they don't have power. They have power. Their actions matter to the entire culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that over and over again, both in journalism, often food journalism, and in restaurants, where if there's not an adequate accounting and of one's own position and one's own privilege in the hierarchy, and it's also business, also like I think startups suffer from the same thing quite often as well. It's like you have a hustler, someone who started from nothing, and their self-image and their sense of responsibility hasn't evolved commensurate with their power.
Mm-hmm.
So they act in ways that wouldn't be abusive if they didn't have power, but are when they do.
Right.
To Kwame's point earlier about, like, sort of to synthesize what a lot of people were saying, I think the behavior that was lauded before still happens, but now it's a liability. So you're going to have some people who chased that sort of excessive, abusive lifestyle because of, like, Tony and because of those guys. Now it's no longer trendy. I think it's a good thing that that's no longer trendy. That's no longer acceptable. So you'll have some people who will migrate towards virtue. You'll have the people who will continue to act poorly, but mask it for sort of marketing reasons. And then you'll have the people who are sort of unrepentant. I do think it's kind of in between both. We haven't completely turned the page, but it's definitely a different chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, I wrote about omelets.
I think about you every time I use a fork in a pan. I'm like, ooh, I can't believe Jacques Pepin did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a really good example, like to tie it back into the rest of our conversation.
He's a really interesting example. Yeah. Different.
Because I feel like he did work in kitchens, and he worked under that brigade system in the French style, and he worked under that brigade system here as well. But I mean, am I with him every day? No. But my understanding of him, and to the extent that I know him, his spirit wasn't like that. So, and I don't feel like he succumbed to that structure and the abuse that it sort of encourages.
I mean, I think there are abusers and there are not abusers, and abusers will find ways to abuse people.
Yeah.
Like, I think inherently. So, like, yes, there are some chefs or some people within every single industry, you know, you have bosses that are just like not good people. And there may be something psychologically wrong with them, you know, something that Kenji said, like they may need to do some work on themselves, you know, counseling, you know, to see that they're doing something wrong to someone. And because it's not socially acceptable, they're just not going to do the socially acceptable pieces of abuse, but they're going to find a way to do something. And that's where I say it's not, this stuff doesn't just get better overnight. You know, people that are better in this industry, that feel like they're underdog, that feel like they deserve more, that also have all this power that they don't really understand that they have, continue to find ways to abuse people and push them out of this industry. And it's something that's a cycle, and it's unfortunate. But I think what we really need to do is do the work, you know, like get into therapy, be self-reflective, see how you're treating people, see if there are trends in the way people are reacting to the way that you are portraying yourself, and the way that you're leading. And I think that's when change really happens, when it's proactive instead of reactive.
In terms of,
you know, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kenji.
I was going to say, you know, one of the things that I found hardest is that there is, you know, the whole, I mean, the idea of hazing. I mean, I think, and I don't know if this is me or if this is everyone, or if this is just most people, and some people are completely unaffected by it. But the way kitchens worked, it's like you do go through this hazing process, and then finally you feel like there's this moment of breakthrough where it's like, oh, okay, now these people respect. I've earned their respect.
They're my friends. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and so you feel you it's so hard. It's so hard not to feel grateful for the abuse that you went through. At least it was for me. It's like, oh, I get it now. Now I appreciate why they were pushing me around like this. It all makes sense. Like it's all so that I could get to this level. And you know, and then you watch like documentaries about like cults and stuff, and think to yourself, why are these people putting themselves through this abuse? And it's because there's this like psychological thing where it's like the more abuse you're put through when you're finally accepted, like the more you feel like the abusers were always doing it for your own benefit and not for their whatever needs. And so that cycle is just so difficult to break out of.
I think that's one of the things about kitchens, which as a journalist, I mean, is so sort of seductive, is that it's an internal world with its own logic. And within its logic, it's functional. I mean, it's a completely dysfunctional, sort of abusive, unhealthy world, but it's rare to see such a completely realized mini society which abuts so closely to something that we associate with pleasure and luxury.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I feel like in some way the fact, and that was, I mean, this is not Tony Bourdain's fault at all. And I think that when you read Kitchen Confidential, he's valorizing it in some way, but when you go back and read it, it was received, I think, in a different way than it was put forth. But I think one of the reasons why it was so popular is because it's like a completely realized subculture.
Yeah.
Now what I think is happening is we're cracking that open and saying, well, how does this align with our values outside of that subculture? Especially because, like I said, it has to do with our pleasure. And I know as like a restaurant critic, for me, it wasn't, no matter how well executed and how on point the flavors were on a plate, if you knew what was going on behind those kitchen doors, or even let's talk about discrimination in terms of front of house staff, in terms of, sort of health insurance, like you can't isolate the plate and then everything beyond. And I think for me this is about food writing, like from a food writing standpoint, that's been a huge shift in evolution. You can't see beauty in one aspect and then see a lack of beauty in another and still enjoy that beauty.
Yeah, I think you're talking about there's the question of ethics, but it's larger, it's a more holistic view of what we're talking about when we like read a restaurant review or go to a restaurant. And I think that's a change that's been sort of building up in the past couple of years, even just since we started this book, and it's been reflected in the types of essays and the types of pieces that we've been selecting, whether it's restaurant reviews or criticism about the art of the restaurant review. But what I want to get to is how, so it feels like we've been building up this momentum to reach this sort of like, okay, now, the ethical consumption in food. And then the pandemic hit this year, and that has really like completely decimated everything. And how are we going to go forward, and how are we going to build off of that, knowing what we know now? Like, I think Hannah's already experiencing this. Like, I don't know that when I do go back to restaurants that it's ever going to be, like it was before. And I'm going to think about a lot more, I'm going to think about, because of COVID and because of, like I live in New York, and there's been a lot of arguments over whether restaurants and bars should be open when schools aren't, and all of that kind of thing. And it makes me think about I think more than ever about restaurants as businesses caring for workers, as well as places that I enjoy having taste bud pleasures. Like, how is that going to change for us going forward when things do, next year, when we have a vaccine and life begins to get back to normal?
Well, let me ask you that. I mean, do you think that in a year's time, this mindfulness and will fade back as the familiar patterns reassert themselves? Like to me, my fear is we're kind of like bubbling up to a moment of consciousness, and then we'll go back down. I don't know. I'd be curious what everyone else thinks about. I mean, that's my own cynical, or not cynical. That's my own fear, I guess.
From my perspective, having, at least talking to my food writer friends, most of them seem to be sort of on the same page as you and Hannah and Silvia on this, where they feel a different sort of responsibility as food writers and reviewers, to really look into who they're supporting. And I just from the individuals I know, like, I don't see them forgetting about that a year from now. It is, there is always the danger of things becoming too comfortable, which is what happens, right? Like, when things become too comfortable and we don't notice the problems around the edges. But I don't see that happening anytime soon, certainly on an individual level. I think it might be easy for the general public to sort of forget what's going on. But I do still think that at least the gatekeepers, the ones who are writing the reviews and deciding what's hot and where people should go eat and whatever, that they will, whether it's at the forefront or not, will still be paying attention to that, which in the end is going to influence, I think, where people choose to dine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of responsibility that lies with the kind of leaders of the industry. Like, what are the biggest names going to be doing? Are they going to be changing in ways that kind of set set the standard. I don't know that will work, honestly, but I do think that will happen to some degree. But I also agree with Josh. I think a lot of things are just not going to change at all. One thing I wonder is, I mean, I don't know, this is more posing a question. It's like, it seems to me that working in a restaurant, I mean, we learned, and I personally learned so much about the way restaurants work during this pandemic. And what I learned, kind of bottom line, is that the margins are so much thinner than
they don't work.
They don't work, right? Like even the restaurants that you think of as being the most successful, it's not like they have money in the bank and they can just and the government isn't saving any money in the bank for them either. So it's just like it all falls apart in a situation like this. And there are lots of potential situations like this. I hate to be, like a doomsayer, but I don't think this is going to be a totally isolated incident in, going forward. And so I do wonder if it's going to change, the appeal of working in restaurants for chefs, for young creative people or for people, I was noticing, I think in the last 10, 15 years, it's like being a front of house person in a restaurant has started to become like a real career path. It's not just a thing you're doing while you're waiting to do something else. People were taking it really, really seriously and feeling like it was a legitimized and legitimate, career. Are people not going to want to work in restaurants anymore? I guess that's.
I think people always work in restaurants. It's a great entry level job for people at the base. It is an in between job for some people, but also it's a career for some as well. And I think if there are certain people in this world like me, like Kenji, that just we're crazy, love food. We'll do this every single day, and there's no other industry for us besides like branching out into other crossing over into writing and stuff like that. I do want to say that it starts with us having these conversations. So like back in the day, whatever you want to call it, the 80s, the 70s, there were no conversations like this about restaurant culture and how they can be better. And when you start talking about something, that is, you're on the train tracks for progress. That's it. And I think that my generation, people that are saying, no, you can't talk to me like this, I'm going to say something about it. It makes it harder for people to continue that abuse. Now, they may find other ways to abuse people, but in its core, the kitchen culture will eventually change because people are speaking up about it. Will it happen overnight? Absolutely not. Nothing does. And nothing worth it happens overnight. But I think we are on a path because we have great people like this talking about these issues and highlighting them in award-winning books. So yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful for the future of the restaurant industry. I think we're going to go through it's going to get worse before it gets better, especially because of the pandemic. A lot of restaurants are not going to make it. Even though they're open, they're extremely short-staffed because they can't afford to bring all of their people back at 25% occupancy. So inherently, you have to treat these people nice now because you need them more than ever. And I think that's going to also shift the way that restaurants operate. It's more familial. It's more like a team. Let's all do this together, and let's get through this tough period. And then when we get out of this pandemic, I think the industry will be changed forever for the better.
I think something that's been interesting to witness for me from I don't have a restaurant, I'm a food writer, but more than just writing about food, I'm someone who lives in the world. And how I've seen the relationship, my relationship with restaurateurs has narrowed to the folks in my neighborhood who are open, but those small relationships have really deepened. And I don't want to say they've transcended capitalism because it's still transactional in some way, but it's also not. Like my baker, the guy who runs a cafe near my house, like he shared starter with me, and then I bought like gourds for him from upstate for his, it's like, it's much more human. The other thing I wanted to say, Hannah, about like whether people want to work in restaurants, and Kwame, you brought it up too. It's like, I just did that No Moi Tea Parlor cookbook, and I was talking to the chef Wang Gao, who's like 75, maybe 80. And so I was doing the Il Buco cookbook at the same time as the No Moi book. The Il Buco cookbook is all about like, I have this passion for food. I love cooking. This is my dream, that narrative, which I think is great. And the One Gal narrative was like, I came to America with no money and I didn't speak English. And do I love to cook? I mean, it's a fucking job, you know? And
Right.
you know, he put his 2 kids through college and he's still at it. And I think maybe people won't be drawn to the allure of restaurants because maybe that allure is lost. But to Kwame's point, it's a huge intake into the labor force. So I think that aspect will continue.
I guess part of what I was asking there is just thinking about how, like, and I guess there are a lot of industries that are like this too, but you know, when the pandemic struck, it's like already working at a restaurant, if you're not, I mean, at a lot of restaurants, I think no matter what job you're doing, you don't have health insurance.
Yeah.
You don't have like a salary. A lot of, you know, like just I guess I was thinking specifically of like the kind of payment structure and the security, the job security. And it seems like the pandemic just sort of highlighted how fragile it is to be a restaurant worker, but that's true of so many other, I mean, that's true for like a Broadway dancer or
the pandemic for me for restaurants was like that 5-finger death punch in Kill Bill, where it's like they were already dead, you know, and then the COVID came and they just took those 5 steps and all of that rotten inside proved fatal. I mean, that's a little, maybe like a bit of a downer, but like,
very true to Kill Bill, though.
It was very descriptive at the very least.
But like those, but to your point, Hannah, like all of those factors, the abuse, the financial exploitation, those things were already there. And it was like the tide dropped and you could see the terrain under it.
Right. So I guess I'm wondering if post-pandemic, some of that will change a little bit. Will it be, I mean, I've definitely heard restaurateurs say that, not many of them, but I haven't talked, I mean, but some of the people I've talked to feel that stuff has to change too, that it has to be a better career, that working in a restaurant you have to be more secure. That
I mean, but that's a slippery slope because like the tariffs, you know, the taxes that we have in restaurants, and the amount that we can charge for food, it doesn't allow for this, like, you know, lucrative career as a line cook. And it should be a transitional job. Like, and if it's not, then that's what you want to do and that's okay. But like, you can't give a line cook 80 grand a year. We just can't afford it. And also the main thing is rent. An onion, the price of an onion hasn't really changed in the past 10 years. Like, but the rent has gone up substantially, especially in these major cities where you can at least make a little bit of money. So it's like, it's hard to say that like restaurants should just be like paying people. I mean, even as an executive chef, I didn't really make a lot of money. So like,
no, but I don't think the burden is on the restaurants. I don't mean to say that at all. The burden is on, you know, legislation to prevent landlords from gouging restaurants completely arbitrarily. I'm not saying I'm in agreement with you. I'm in agreement with you. I'm saying that there needs to be, you know, more tax write-offs for restaurants. We need to be getting breaks on rent. And, you know, just more aid from the government, because we also employ so many people in this country, as for first-time jobs, for seniors. You know, this industry is, like Joshua was saying, it was already hurting so much, and then we got the punch of death, and it's horrible.
You know, one of the even more difficult parts about it is that the cost of what people pay for food in restaurants from the bottom to the top is not reflective of what it actually costs to produce and serve that food. You know, as you're saying, most restaurants operate on razor thin margins, and you know, and that's true whether you're, you know, like a place like mine, which is very, you know, like a family oriented casual place. And you know, and we have a sous chef, but we don't have like a whole hierarchical tiered system. Most people are just experienced line cooks, you know, and they're working hourly, but it's like, people, the cost of living in San Francisco or in the Bay Area is more, workers have to live in houses with very large extended families or with friends, or they have to commute in from far away, because the cost of rent goes up, but it's not just the cost of rent on the restaurant, it's the cost of rent for the employees also. And the cost of food doesn't go up to match that. And then when you get to the high end places like Per Se, they also don't make a huge margin, but they're also relying on like a ton of free labor. It's like and Kwame can probably talk to this, but at restaurants I worked in 15, 20 years ago, it's like at any given moment probably 30 to 50% of the people working in the kitchen were completely unpaid. They're doing stages, and they're there just for sort of the experience. And it's like I was working for one chef, and it's like I got paid to work 5 days a week at one of his restaurants, but then I worked the other 2 days for free at his other restaurants because I wanted the experience. But it's like, and because then when you're working all the time, you don't have the time to spend the money that you're not making. But it's not, the cost of a hamburger, even like at my restaurant in Wursthall, we charge, I think it's $16 for a hamburger now. But that's like that once you actually break it down and look at the costs that go into it, it barely covers them. It's like we don't turn a huge profit. I've never made a penny off the restaurant, and neither of any of the owners or investors yet. So I think people, it's tough because it's like, on the one hand, it's like restaurants, they were getting screwed to begin with, and on top of that, it's like people aren't paying what it costs to actually provide a great living wage for people, or even a decent living wage for people, much less like healthcare. I know there are some restaurants that can manage to do healthcare and all that, and that's great.
Yeah, my restaurant, we did healthcare, but we made zero money at all. And I think more importantly, like to Hannah's point, we need to look at the business model of restaurants. Like, does it make sense to operate this business? Who is it doing a favor to? It's not doing a favor to the staff. I'm losing money. Okay, I get a couple articles written about me a year, and what else? Like, are you actually helping the community, or are you just serving crudo for $22? So like, what are these restaurants really doing? What is their purpose? And I think now that, yes, because of Tony's book, we are lauded as some sort of rock star-ish, people like are very attracted to the food industry. Since we have this platform, how can we change that? And how can we actually look at this as business people? Like, will this make money? Will this be profitable? Will this provide a means of income for staff? Will this take care of the community? If it's not checking any of those boxes, then why are we opening up a restaurant besides our own ego? And I think that's where we need to really look at this restaurant industry moving forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to second what Kwame's saying, and also just that it's both. Restaurants need to be supported on a structural governmental level, a legislative level, which is like Hannah's point. You're part of it. I think it needs the foundational support. And then to Kenji's point, there is and has been an artificially depressed price people are willing to pay for food, and the people who eat that price are the people who work in restaurants. And my first impulse is to say, just charge more. But I'm reminded of Zephyr Teachout, who's like an amazing writer and politician, and she's great. That the idea of just voting with your pocketbook, like that neoliberal impulse, oftentimes takes the place for political change. And like, what's needed now is fundamental political change to support this industry, if we want to support, which I think we should want to support as a friend of chefs and as a food writer. But it's obviously not cost-free, and it's not as simple as just raising your prices, although that's part of it.
And it's like Kwame said, I mean, I know obviously prices have risen for certain things, but as you said, the cost of an onion hasn't changed. It's like, where is that? Who's getting rich off this? It's not the restaurants. And why? And like, I'm not saying your hamburger isn't worth $10 more to me, but does it cost $10 more because you're like billionaire real estate developer landlord has decided to charge you $50,000 a month or like twice that
Yes.
in rent.
Yes.
Like that's insane. And that just shouldn't, shouldn't have to, as a consumer, even though I think your hamburger is amazing, I shouldn't have to pay $30 for it so that the rich get richer. Just, it's hard to.
That's
rich.
That's killing our industry, is real estate.
Yeah.
And the amount that we have to pay for it. No, I don't agree that a hamburger should be $40. Do I think we should be able to charge it because this shirt costs $1 to make and I probably paid $40 for it? Like it doesn't translate, like our costs doesn't translate to other industries, and it's unfair. But it is something that we have to do 3 times a day, and that's different. We have to eat, like it's food. We need it for nourishment. We need to live. So like, I don't think it's right to be able to charge, you know, $50 for a hamburger and price out so many people that can't afford that meal. But we should be getting a break on our rent at the very least, so we can charge $16 for that hamburger and actually make $12 on it. Like, and that's not a proper food cost analysis, but that's just, that's an example. Like, it's an example. Like if our costs aren't into rent, then we will be more profitable as a business.
Right.
I mean,
and I think
also, can we just also mention, sorry, that like, why are employers paying for healthcare to begin with? Right? Like,
Right.
So that's a different conversation
Right.
for best American political writing. But
best American activism.
Universal healthcare, universal healthcare and universal basic income would solve. Well, I think would solve a lot of these problems, or at least help a lot of these problems.
Is it too late for Bernie 2020?
Bernie could still win. Okay,
win.
so I think what what Kwame is saying also is this idea of like we're having, you know, you said earlier in this conversation tonight that you know, we're just by having the conversation, we're already making progress. And I think that we're starting to have like another level of conversation, which is like, what are restaurants for? Who are they for? But not just at the chef level and the business level, but like at the policy and human level, right? At the community level, like you were saying, it's not just about, you know, who are we providing for, not just who's making a profit, or are we helping the community, but the sort of like the broader view of like, what is our purpose here? What are we doing here? It's no longer just about like, you know, it's no longer as simple.
James Beard Award. It's like,
it's no longer so straightforward.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is great. I want to turn a little bit to some of the questions that we've had come in, and if you guys want to add any questions in the Q&A box. But we did, going back recently to what we were talking about with people staging and working for free in restaurants, Monique Aldred is asking, do you think working for free in restaurants will go away after COVID? And to sort of echo our earlier theme, if I had to guess, I would probably say, no, I don't think it will stop. I think people will continue to work for free.
It's technically illegal in most places now. You can't do it anymore.
So yes, it will stop.
I don't think it'll go away. Hell no, because I'll stay like as a cook, like I'll stay a little bit longer so I can learn how to break down fish off the pot.
Exactly.
Like so, like I think that there's going to be some sort of balance, and there's going to be people that abuse that as well. Like, can you stay a little bit later? Can you work service? Can you do this party? And as long as we're doing these events for, you know, I'm not going to name drop, but all these events where chefs are invited and they don't get paid, like they bring a cook for experience to help them plate up for 1,000 people. So like, I don't think it'll ever go away. Hell no.
But it won't be.
I mean, I think that's every industry though, right? Like for experience, you do that in every industry. So
definitely, we went through that with media. There was a lot of hand wringing over internships, and you know, part of that is who has the ability and the access to work for free.
Yeah.
But there is, but also who, you know, there is that payoff. It's undeniable that there is that experience is valuable, and you know, you learn things that you wouldn't otherwise have. So it's a complicated one.
Right, but I feel like the fact, like that's another sort of, I mean, I know this is what you were saying, but like, yes, you do get that experience and there is a lot of benefit, and yet there's already a gate through which one must pass in order to avail themselves of that experience. So it's another way of embedded privilege. It's like legacy admission.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's partly why I think the world of celebrity chefs and the world of food writing is so white male heavy, because generally they're the ones who are able to do those free internships and the staging and get all the sort of experience they need without having to worry as much about where the money is early on.
What do you guys think of the feasibility? This is Holly Reagan's question. What do you think about the feasibility of a collective / worker-owned restaurant model becoming more widespread? Interesting.
So I think in order for that to happen, people have to have a very different expectation of what restaurants are. Like I think part of the problem right now is that a lot of, and this is partly due to Food Network and Bourdain and this sort of celebrity chef culture, is that restaurants are not seen as necessarily as a collective endeavor. They're seen as an extension of the chef's personality. And so I feel pressure as a chef. It's like people are not just judging the restaurant by the quality of the food. That's one thing. It's like that I have a business obligation there, but they're judging me on the quality of the food. And so so it's like even me like moving away to a different city. It's like I had to really make sure like the people who are running it day to day, that I trust them and that they know what they're doing. But so I think in order for a restaurant to become so there's a few different issues. So that's part of it. I think the other one, it's like how many people would want to go in on a on a worker-owned restaurant, knowing how often restaurants fail versus just getting $21 an hour or whatever the pay rate is. It's like even with salaries, it's like I've had employees who I've wanted to push to salaried positions, or who we wanted to take in as partners and offered incentives in that way. And a lot of times people are just, no, it's like, I'd rather keep my options open. Like I know how the restaurant industry is. Like I'll just work for the paycheck and keep my options open. And so it's in order for a worker, in order for any business to be like, the reason restaurants get funded is mainly because investors want it's cool to invest in a restaurant, and they want to be part of something that's cool. Nobody really ever goes into restaurants thinking it's a good business. Maybe you hope to break even, or maybe you hope to succeed in it, but I'm sure everyone hopes to succeed, but it's not a good business move. Like,
do you think that would change?
Looking at the basic numbers,
do you think that would change at all if we reconceived restaurants as more? This is present in my mind because I just watched Mangrove, which is very much about this. Restaurants as community centric, more community centers and sustained by the local community. I know that.
Well, yeah, are we talking about like the cheese board? Are we talking about co-ops? Like that. Yeah. Those exist. I would love to see how they're faring, and I would also love to like understand their economic model a little bit better. But that is one example for sure.
I also think that we've seen with the Jose Andres model of World Central Kitchen that restaurants can actually become part of the community and feed the community that cannot afford to eat at their restaurant. And I think if we were to implement that into our business model, we could get government grants that could help subsidize our rent. And I think that's the way we should be looking at opening restaurants, is 2 services, 3 services a week, the slow one, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for lunch. You're just cooking for the community. You're cooking for hospital workers. There are people that need food, and there are companies like No Kid Hungry that will pay for that food to go to the proper people. And we have the infrastructure and the manpower to do that. And I think once we think of it like that, as true community centers, true cornerstones of our community, we can then leverage that for government assistance that will then cut down on that rent that we need to actually survive. And that's what I plan on doing for my next restaurant. I helped with World Central Kitchen, and I saw that model, and I was like, holy shit, we can just do this all the time. And we're actually helping our community, and we can get paid for those meals that can go straight towards, profit. But it's not profit. It's not blood money. It's like actually you're really helping your community. And I think that should just be the norm for every single restaurant. And when that happens, I think that's when restaurants will thrive. But it takes us going through a huge pandemic like this to really see what we're capable of. And I see the restaurant industry kind of rejuvenating in a better way. We're getting rid of this abuse. We're looking at how we can feed our communities. And we just need to figure out how to leverage that and make sure that we're a profitable business, because there's no point in getting into a restaurant if you're not actually making money. It's a business at the end of the day, and it shouldn't be looked at as a passion project.
Yeah, So what advice do you have? I'm going to start with Hannah, but what advice do you have for people? This is sort of addresses one of the questions. Barbara Florence asking sort of how can she be a better consumer? So what have you learned through the pandemic, and what advice do you have for consumers going forward to sort of to be more aware, to pay more attention, learn more about, not just what they're eating and where, but like how can they tell if a restaurant is being run well or responsibly? How can they consume ethically?
Well, I like to think that I am help you do that by doing some of that work and figuring out. I feel like that's my job as a writer now, is to write about, either write in support of places that I have determined are being run ethically and should be supported, or write, critically about places that aren't. So read me. But I hope that that's a trend in food writing, at least in some food writing. I know it's something that a lot of food writers are thinking about, a lot of publications are thinking about. And I'm seeing it happen. I'm seeing it like transform in real time. And then otherwise, I do reporting and research, but I do feel like, just as a consumer, like social media is actually really useful in determining that, or it can be. Like, restaurants have to have social media presences now, I would say. And it's worth, I'm not saying this is like a total catch-all, but it's worth going and looking at a restaurant's Instagram profile, going and like Googling restaurants and just seeing what you find. I think that that's not necessarily something that people were doing before. You just you heard a restaurant was good and you went there, or this ties into what I'm saying about food writing in general, I think. But I think that a lot of restaurateurs are being vocal about this stuff, and I'm thinking in particular some people that I've written about recently who are using their social media platforms to explain what they're doing and how they're thinking differently about their businesses and how they're treating their employees and what they're doing, in terms of philanthropy. And so I think that a lot of the information is there if you look for it.
I also think that we know who's bad and who's good in this industry. Like, it's a small industry, so it's just like this person's an asshole, like this person is not good, and then a lot of people but their food is great, but they're so cool, and it's we've given people a pass for so long, and kind of enabled this behavior because of the vibe that they create at these restaurants. So I love the idea of researching what's going on with someone doing philanthropy or giving back, but also just being honest with ourselves. Like, the chefs that have gotten called out, we knew that they were not good people. Nothing was a surprise. It wasn't oh, this person did this one thing. No way. It was yeah, I'm surprised they didn't get called out for more stuff. So I think we have to, and when I'm talking about we, I mean myself included, people in this industry have to hold our peers more accountable. And I think that's really where that true change comes as well. And then it'll trickle down to the consumer.
I sort of disagree a little bit. I think that in terms of ethical consumption, that stuff's important, voting with your pocketbook, but that is also the Milton Friedman fallacy, right? If you want to see real change, it's political change. You don't vote with your pocketbook, you actually engage in direct political action. So many of the issues that we've talked about this evening have a legislative and policy-oriented solution. So instead of saying, oh, well, I'm going to eat at this place and boycott this other place, it's no, push for that direct political action. That's what makes a change. And also, don't eat at the asshole's restaurant. But it's the same thing. It's just so present in my mind, just because it's Cyber Monday, and it's yeah, I hate Amazon. Does that mean I'm a bad person for shopping at Amazon? Can I boycott Amazon? No, I can't. But that doesn't mean that I can't fight on a policy level for anti-monopoly legislation. And in the same way, there's plenty of political and policy-oriented solutions that we can advocate for. And I think if you want to think about consuming ethically, think as a citizen, think as someone with agency on that level.
I agree with that, absolutely. But I also think that some of the voting with your dollars, as you put it, can contribute to that kind of indirectly, because I think I think that restaurateurs and leaders in the industry can be really powerful politically. You know, we've seen that during the pandemic. A lot of like the biggest restaurateurs have formed these, you know, coalitions and have become are lobbying Congress and stuff. So I think that it is like, if you can find, like, I think like I'm thinking of a few people in particular who I feel like they're being super vocal, and in supporting them, you're giving them the just kind of support that they need to then go and try to make these political changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's yes and not either or.
Yes,
I mean,
right.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Yeah.
And we've seen what voting with your dollar can do to a restaurateur that is not ethical. It can shut down their whole operation. So I think it does work, you know. But yeah, it's both.
Yeah, it's one of the tools in the toolkit.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
This has been
We went
so
over.
great. No, hey, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I wish we should have booked it for 2 hours, right? We could have kept going. So East Coast people might not have been delighted with that.
Well,
It's almost my
I got a
bedtime.
toddler to feed also.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the really great discussion. It could not have been more timely. And I feel like, you know, this book is sort of, it's sort of the summary of before times. And I can't wait to see what next year's version of this book is like and where we are a year from now. So thank you so much for participating tonight and for your contributions to writing and restaurants and all of this. So thank you so much. Reminder to all of you out there, you can get the book at booklarder.com, and Kenji will sign them and they will ship in about a week. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. Be safe and healthy and all those good things. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.